I'm William Bell with Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. Welcome to Probing the Prophets with Rod MacArthur. Join us every Friday from 11 a.m. until 12 noon Central Standard Time for an exciting adventure through the prophets with Rod MacArthur. Rod MacArthur, husband, father, grandfather, gardener of roses and veggies, Bible student, enamored of the prophets since 1972, hosts a discussion 40 years in the making. Currently living in Auburn, Washington, Rod has preached in Moscow, Idaho, Spokane, Washington, and Terre Haute, Indiana, before moving to Auburn. Welcome to Probing the Prophets with Rod.
Well, good morning. Rod here. And last week we left Jacob in a very precarious circumstance, at least as far as he was concerned. You might recall that he was pleading with God. He said in Genesis 32:11, "Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him." And so there was a man that was riddled with fear, 20 plus years old, removed from the incidents that aroused the animosity, shall we say, the hatred, the revenge-driven motives in Esau's heart. But that gives us somewhat of an idea of just how long-term these feud attitudes could be expected to linger in that part of the world at that time. Jacob, 20 years later, was still afraid, but he reached out to the one source who had promised to bring him back to his land and stay with him until everything that he had promised would be fulfilled. You remember that promise God made Jacob at the latter scene. I will stay with you until I have kept every promise I've made to you, which we understood included the promise of the one who would bless the whole world. And so, quite a promise from God. I'll never leave you nor forsake you. Of course, that's picked up then in the book of Hebrews, implied not to the physical lineage of Jacob, but to the spiritual lineage of Jacob, all the physical lineage that followed Messiah out, as well as all of the Gentiles who also followed Messiah. God said, "I'll never forsake you." But here we have Jacob still in the angst of that situation. You know, that comforts me to know that men as well received and well respected as Jacob could have trembling doubts as they faced life circumstances, even though there was a promise of God that was undergirding all of their actions. It's human to lose sight of the significant things and be traumatized by the immediate and peripheral things. And so Jacob was here. "Deliver me because I'm afraid," was his prayer. And then he appealed to God's promise, "because you said," verse 12, "I will surely prosper you and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude." So I know this promise is here. That's why I have the confidence to appeal to you while I'm afraid. I love that as well, that fear is not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a motivating thing, as it was here with Jacob, and can motivate us to reach out to the promise and to the promisor, or promiser, and so have our anchor in the heart of the one who is willing to promise. And so, but he didn't leave it there. And then he divided his family into two sections, and sent one on across the brook Arno, and kept the other one on this one side, and while he himself stayed at the camp. And so as he's there by himself, where the camp had been, in the dark of the night, a man comes upon him. Verse 22, now he arose that same night and took his 2 wives and his 2 maids and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. I said the Arno, it's the Jabbok. And he took them and sent them across the stream, and sent across whatever he had. So he sent them. Now the Jabbok feeds into the Jordan from the east, and so Jacob would be on one side of the Jabbok, and his family, his two companies, family and goods divided into the 2 companies, would be on the other side of the Jabbok. And so in the middle of the night, perhaps Esau, not being privy to the fact that everybody is gone except Jacob, might send an assassin into where the camp had been. I'm speculating what Jacob was thinking. I fear him. Send these people away. I'll stay here. And sure enough, in verse 24, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. And so there was an assassin. And I'm saying that in quotations. I'm looking at it from Jacob's point of view. And initially, this would have been taken as an assailant of some sort, perhaps sent by his brother Esau to kill him. Fear can play tricks on the mind. And though they wrestled together until daybreak, and when he saw that he had not prevailed against him, you kind of get lost in the pronouns there, but when the man saw that he had not prevailed against Jacob, he, that is the man, touched the socket of Jacob's thigh. So the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while Jacob, wrestled with him, the man. Then the man said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So the man, said to him, what is your name? And Jacob, said, Jacob. And the man, said, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. Israel means the mighty one of God, or he who strives with God, the powerful one who's able to strive with God. Now, there's the interesting aspect of this. Of course, here your name is going to be changed to Israel. Later, God himself appears and confirms that. But I will not turn you loose until you give me a blessing. The interesting thing is that Hosea uses this incident as an appeal to a wayward nation that they should be like their father. Let me go over here to Hosea 12, where Hosea says, Ephraim feeds on wind, and he pursues east wind continually. Probably a reference to seeking out allies and the idols of the powerful nations, the gods of the powerful nations, for protection and deliverance, rather than relying upon Yahweh. He multiplies lies, that would be within the culture, and violence, that we're willing to not be truthful and brutal. We're willing to be brutal with each other. Moreover, he makes a covenant with Assyria, and oil is carried to Egypt. Yahweh also has a dispute with Judah. So that's what Ephraim, the 10 northern tribes, that's what they're doing. But Yahweh also has a dispute with Judah, and will punish Jacob according to his ways. He will repay him according to his deeds. Now, here's what it was like to be Jacob early on. In the womb, he took his brother by the heel. Jacob and Esau, we know that story. Jacob is called Jacob because the name Jacob means one who takes his brother by the heel, or more to the point, one who comes up from behind and trips by grabbing the heel so as to get advantage and go ahead. Not necessarily a wonderful name to be carrying through life, but that's what he did. He took his brother by the heel in the womb, and in his maturity he contended with God. Well, where did he contend with God? You might say the various times he prayed to God, but specifically, Hosea says, yes, he wrestled with the angel and prevailed. So he's referring right back to this very story. He wrestled with the angel. So it was more than a man. It was a messenger from Yahweh, an angel. He wrestled with him all night long and prevailed. How do we know he prevailed? Because he got a blessing from him. I will not let you go until you give me a blessing. And he changed his name to Mighty Man of God, or from the one who takes his brother by the heel to the one who prevails over God. And what's his point? He found him at Bethel, and there he spoke with us. Even Yahweh, the God of hosts. Yahweh is his name. Therefore, return to your God. Observe kindness and justice, and wait for your God continually. So the picture that comes out of this story of Jacob fearing Esau is that he would struggle with God all night long for a blessing. And that's what Hosea wanted his nation to do as they were on the, as Barry McGuire used to say, on the eve of destruction, that they were about to go off into captivity, and so they needed to earnestly seek out and wrestle with God if it took all night long. Now I'm going to stop here and just interject this idea, as the Hebrews writer said, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The idea that he does not change, there is no shifting shadow or variation in God, as though he's one way one time and another way another time. He's the same all the time, and if this man could struggle with God all night long and prevail and get a blessing, why can't I? Why do I shortchange God, shortchange myself by throwing up a prayer one time and hoping that he hears and not being persistent in it? How badly did Jacob want to be delivered from his brother? And just that badly he prayed, just that desperately, just that focusedly, is that a good adverb? With just that much intensity and focus, with just that much determination, he struggled to get the blessing. What about me? How badly do I want the blessing, and how deeply do I believe God can give me the blessing, and how willing am I to continue to struggle in prayer for the blessing? Well, that's what I'm seeing here in this story of you made me a promise, it's threatened by this, help me. And so he wrestled until he got the blessing. Now, I want to push on into chapter 35. Skip over 33 and 34. There's great stuff there, but I'm really wanting to focus on the material that looks at the relationship of God to man, and especially in covenant relationship and the things to come. And so I have here in the end part of 34, the brothers of Dinah avenge her rape by slaughtering all the men in the village of Shechem. And Jacob is so concerned that this would make him, his small batch of people, who he's just escaped from Esau, pleaded and fled from Esau, and and came back finally. And now he's concerned about the inhabitants of the land because of the impetuous nature of his sons, Levi and Simeon, who strapped on the sword and slaughtered the men while they were in the agony of their circumcision. I'm afraid you've made us odious sons, and so he now needs to flee from them. I'm saying all that as backdrop for what we're going to read here in chapter 35. In 35, then God said to Jacob, "Arise and go up to Bethel and live there and make an altar there to God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." Now, the interesting aspect of this, and maybe it's irony, but here, when he fled from Esau, God appeared to him in the latter vision, and he made an altar there. But now, at this point, he's afraid of the people of the land. God says, go up to Bethel. That's where you landed when you fled from your brother, and now you're fleeing from the inhabitants of the land, so go there. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, "Put away the foreign gods who are among you, and purify yourself, and change your garments, and let us arise and go up to Bethel. And I will make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and has been with me wherever I have gone." Now, that's a verse that is worth highlighting, underscoring, in some way calling your attention back to. Here it is after 20 plus years of experience of fleeing from Esau to go find a wife, being delivered from the father-in-law and the brother, all that Jacob had accumulated, including the wives and the children. He was willing to take away and send Jacob home empty-handed, yet God intervened. He came back and he wrestled with an angel, and when he saw Esau, it was all good. He says, that God, the God who heard me, who answered me in the day of my distress, and has been with me wherever I have been. So we're going to worship him there, make an altar to him. So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods which they had, and the rings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak which was near Shechem. As they journeyed, there was a great terror upon the cities which were around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. The protecting force field of God protected this man who entrusted himself to God. Notice what he did. He told his whole family, you get rid of these foreign gods, and let's call upon the name of our God, the God who hears me and answers me in distress and is with me wherever I am. That's a God worth committing to. And so God, protected them as they obeyed him and went on up to Bethel. Dropping down to verse 9, 35:9, then God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram and blessed him. So we got Jacob has come back from Padan Aram, worried about Esau, got in trouble with the villagers from Shechem, has come up to Bethel. So God appeared to him again and blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. So as the angel blessed Jacob at the end of their all-night struggle, here God confirms, ratifies, and formally proclaims it. Your name shall be called Israel. And thus he called his name Israel. God also said to him, I am God Almighty, El Shaddai, God Almighty. El is the name, is the word God. Elohim is the word God made plural. We would say God, gods. They would say El, Elohim. But El and Shaddai is all powerful. I am God all powerful. I'm the only God there is. You be fruitful and multiply. Interesting. Same thing he told Adam. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come forth from you. And the land which I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give it to you. And I will give you the land. I will give the land to your descendants after you. So here's God repeating the blessing and telling him, here's my plan. Here's what I'm going to do. You're fleeing from these people, but you're going to possess this land. The dread of you is on them now. You and your offspring will possess this land. So let's move on now in chapter 37. Chapter 37, we come to the story of Joseph. Joseph is one of Jacob or Israel's 12 sons. He was the firstborn son of the favored wife, Rachel. He wasn't the firstborn in the order of anything, but he was the firstborn from the favored wife, which, as we'll see, Simeon and Reuben and Levi. Now, Simeon and Levi caused the slaughter at Shechem, and Reuben had sexual relations with Jacob's concubine, Bilhah. And as a result of those three actions, even though Reuben was oldest and Simeon and Levi also were the first three, Judah was the fourth born, those three, because of their actions, were demoted so that the messianic blessing then fell upon Judah. But the birthright, the firstborn son of what should have been the first wife, the favored wife, the firstborn son there, he got the double portion, the birthright. And that's why out of Joseph came two tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. I'm taking these in your place, Israel later told him. So Judah got the messianic blessing, and Joseph got the birthright, which gave him two tribes instead of one, Ephraim and Manasseh. So I want us to look at Joseph now, beginning in chapter 37, and there's some interesting details here that we'll want to take note of. Specifically, that Joseph, when he was 17, and got this very colored coat from his father. He was favored. He was pastoring at 17, brought back a bad report, got this multicolored thing. I mean, there's a lot of backstory. And whether he was 17 when he was sold into slavery by his brothers, or maybe 18, I'm leaning toward 18. I'll show you why in a minute. But he's in his late teens, and he had a dream. The dream was, in verse 6, as he related it to his brothers, and verse 5, when he did, they hated him even more. He's not only a rat, he's a braggart. I had a dream. Please listen to my dream. For behold, we, the 12 of us, were binding sheaves in the field, and my sheaf rose up and stood erect, and your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. And then his brother said, are you actually going to reign over us? I mean, they understood the implication of this. You had a dream that you were king, and that you reigned over us, and we bowed down. And so they hated him even more. And then he had another dream in verse 9, and he related it to his brothers, and he said, I had still another dream, and behold, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. The sun, the moon, and the 11 stars. And he related it to his father and to his brothers. His father rebuked him and said, what is this dream that you've had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground?" His brothers were jealous, but his father kept it in mind. Now, this is interesting because of the use of stars here. 11 stars, and Israel immediately knew that it was a reference to the brothers, to his, that is, Israel's sons. He knew that that's what was going on there. These stars represent key people, heads of tribes in this case. In the book of Daniel, chapter 8, when it's talking about the beasts that come up out of the ocean, or they just came. They came onto history. The four beasts, including, but he mainly is focusing on the male goat. The male goat, who was probably Alexander himself. And it says in verse 9, as there was a one that came out of that male goat, probably Antiochus Epiphanes, and it grew up, this horn, this little thing, grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the land, and it trampled them down. Now that's a piece of the vision, and over here in verse 23, it says, in the latter period of their rule. So he's talking about this same vision, explaining it in the latter period of that is the rule of the horns. In the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors, that's the Jewish people, have run, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue. And this is probably, well, I'm not going to go there. I haven't studied deeply enough into it recently to remember who this king is, but his power will be mighty, and that doesn't affect what I'm going to share here. His power will be mighty. He will prosper and perform. He will destroy to an extraordinary extent and prosper and perform. And he will destroy mighty men and the holy people. So he's going to destroy mighty men and the holy people. And through his shrewdness, he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence. He will magnify him in his heart, and he will destroy many while at ease. And he will even oppose the Prince of Princes, but he will be broken. Now, earlier, we read that he would, turn too many pages, that he would cause some of the host and some of the stars to fall. Here in the poetry aspect of it, it says he will destroy many, he will destroy mighty men and the holy people. And so the mighty men would be the stars and the holy people would be the host. So here the stars are used of the mighty men of Israel, whereas the host then, like the Milky Way, would just be the multitude. That may or may sound a little bit oblique. Trust me, it isn't. But over here in the book of Revelation, it's even more clear. In Revelation 12, John saw a great sign which appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Well, this is clearly the picture of the woman, God's wife, and the woman who was in the book of Isaiah referred to as Zion, the mother of God's nation. Well, she was wearing a crown of 12 stars. So the picture of the stars is thus answered by Jacob's interpretation of Joseph's dream. Your brothers. the heads of the tribes of Israel, the stars. So, this story here helps us understand those two that perhaps were a little oblique. Now, maybe you thought I was appealing to the two to determine who the stars were here in Joseph's dream. I was actually going the other way around. I was using Jacob's interpretation of Joseph's dream, the stars equal your brothers, to inform the Daniel passage and the Revelation passage. The stars have already been defined here, and as they occur later in the text, they're carrying this definition with them. They represent your brothers, the heads of the tribes of Israel. All right, I've spent more time on that than I needed to, but found that an interesting piece here in the book of Genesis. Down in verses 18 through 20, 18 through 21, really interesting material here. So the brothers understand the dream. They don't like it. They don't want to see themselves bowing down to this arrogant pipsqueak, this braggart brother of theirs, this one, this favored. Maybe they saw him as the spoiled brat. I don't know how they saw him. I know it was through the eyes of jealousy and bitterness, and not go down that path any further than that. But they knew the dream, and they knew what it meant, and they didn't like it. So Daddy sent Joseph out to find his brothers, take them some provisions, and bring news back of how things were going. It's interesting to me that the brothers were out in the field with the flocks, and Joseph was home with Daddy. Nevertheless, when they saw him, verse 18, when they saw him from a distance, Genesis 37:18, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. So here he comes. He's vulnerable. Daddy's not here, and we hate him. We'll put him to death. Now watch. And they said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Now then, come, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we will say, a wild beast devoured him. Then let us see what will become of his dreams. Yeah, he's got these grandiose dreams, but we, in our hatred and rejection, can thwart him. But Reuben heard and rescued him out of their hands and said, let's not take his life. Let's just throw him in the pit. Reuben's intent was to pull him out of the pit and send him on his way when they weren't looking. But God had a plan. And neither the hostile hatred of the 10, or the 9, I don't guess Benjamin was there at this time, or the compassion, as misguided as it was, of the oldest brother, neither of those could thwart God's plan. Let's see what's going to come of this dream. Well, little did they know that God was using their hatred to further the plan. Nor did Reuben understand that God was using his compassion to dampen or to soften the impact of what the brothers were doing. They wanted to kill him, so they threw him in the pit, unwilling to just kill him and throw him in because of Reuben's intervention. We'll throw him in, and then, whatever they had in mind, until a couple of the brothers saw the Ishmaelite caravan coming and say, hey, we don't want to kill him. He's our brother after all. Let's sell him and make some money on him. And so they sold him for 20 shekels of silver, and thus brought Joseph into Egypt. This is really an interesting story in that here the brothers wanted to kill him and put him in a pit. What did Jesus' brothers do to him? They killed him and put him in a grave. Of course, God raised him out of the grave after 3 days, but killed in their heart by their brothers. If we can say, as the Hebrews writer said in Hebrews 11:17 and following, that Abraham received Isaac back through resurrection in a parable, that he received Isaac back by means of resurrection. even though the boy never physically died, he was dead in Abraham's mind. If that's the case, Joseph is dead in these brothers' mind and cast into a pit. Well, that's exactly what Israel, Judah, did to Jesus. They killed him and put him in a grave. So we have this figure of God's plan to bring his people, keep them alive, and bring them to safety, being played out here in the person of Joseph. Okay, let's go over to a lot of things happen along the way in the story of Joseph. You know, he was pulled up out of the pit and sold to the Midianite caravan, and they brought him into Egypt, and he was purchased there in Egypt by Potiphar. Now, I'm not going through this story to look at the amazing providence of God, but it's just splattered all over this story in iridescent, glow-in-the-dark paint. You can't miss it even with your eyes closed, that God's hand was it. Why was the caravan going to Egypt rather than coming from Egypt when they just happened along the pit at the time that Joseph just happened to be in it? And why, when they got to Egypt with all the people who could be looking for and buying slaves, did he end up with Potiphar? And why was it that Potiphar, who was the captain of the bodyguard, had the prison, or the keep, as it were, for royal prisoners at his house? We read that in chapter 40. That it was, and so when Joseph was put into the keep, he was put in there with men that had been serving in Pharaoh's court. All these things just coincidences, or are these pieces of God bringing his dream to Joseph into reality? Your brothers are going to bow down to you along with your father and your mother. And so all these little steps, but that's not the route that I want to take with this story. It's a fascinating route. But here in chapter 41 at verse 6, that's not the verse I was looking for. Verse 46. That was 41:46. I just forgot to put the 4 down in front of the 6. 41:46, it says, Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh. So it's been at least 12 years since he was sold to the Ishmaelites. Maybe 13 if he was sold at the age of 17, which is the age that he was introduced as being the favored son. It's more likely that some time has transpired. So I'm going to say that it was 12 years from the time that he was brought to Egypt until the time he was elevated to the throne in Egypt. 12 years, kind of an interesting number, but along the way, if you're Joseph day by day, you got these 12 years, and most of them are spent all of them are spent as a slave, and most of them are spent in prison. And you got this dream that you're going to be the ruler of your father and mother and brothers, and you're languishing in prison while they're out there free. It might seem that this isn't working out for me. To his credit, Joseph never, at least as far as the story goes, and you can look at all the heroes in the book of Genesis, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, you can look at them all, and every one has flaws in their character exposed, except Joseph. There is no flaw in Joseph that makes the story. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob all had issues with women. Abraham lied twice about Sarah being his wife because he's afraid of what would happen if he owned her as his wife. His son Isaac did the same thing. Joseph ended up with 4 wives. Some of that was not his doing or his undoing. Joseph had an opportunity to take advantage of a woman who was throwing herself at him on a daily basis, and he wouldn't do it because of his relationship with God. Just a marvelous man. Marvelous story. Chapter 39, verses 2 and 3. And Yahweh was with Joseph. Now, just after we read that Potiphar, this Egyptian, whom we don't know, but kind of whom we come to value because of the nature of the man, but we don't know him at that point. And so he bought Joseph from the slave market, and Yahweh was with Joseph. The story tells us Yahweh was with him as he was purchased as a slave. So he became a successful man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that Yahweh was with him, and Yahweh caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. Now, I want to go on record here and say that at this point in time, there was not a national God, Yahweh. I mean, he had no nation that the world knew about. So that when years later Moses stood before Pharaoh and said, Yahweh said, let my people go and that we might worship him in the wilderness. Pharaoh says, I don't know Yahweh, and I'm not going to let your people go. But here we see prior to that Yahweh was blessing a man who was serving in a house of an Egyptian, and a high-ranking Egyptian, one who served or perhaps answered directly to Pharaoh. So how do those mesh? Well, there's 2 ways to figure that one out. Number one is it says his master saw that Yahweh was with him. He didn't have to know who the God was that was with him. He could just understand that there is a God blessing this man. And maybe Joseph told him it was Yahweh, maybe not. I don't know that. The other thing that we need to understand is that the book of Genesis was compiled by Moses undoubtedly during the wilderness wandering, or perhaps at the time of the deliverance, so that he could present to Israel a biography of God, of Yahweh, their God, whom they didn't know. And so he would use that name for the purpose of saying, this is what your God who's delivering you from Egypt, this is what he's been doing all along. So I don't have a problem with some kind of anachronism going on here that, wow, Exodus says the Egyptians didn't know Yahweh, and Genesis says that they did. I don't have a problem with that for those 2 reasons. I want to press on. The point I'm really making is that Joseph sold into slavery. The very next verse says, and Yahweh was with him. We drop down to verse 20, and this is after the seduction, the failed seduction by Mrs. Potiphar, and then the accusation and the recriminations that come out of that. And so in verse 20, so Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in jail. But, verse 21, Yahweh was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. So when he became a servant in an Egyptian household, he was over-sheltered by the force field of God's protection. Here, when then he is demoted, that doesn't mean God's force field of protection failed, it means it's another part of the plan, because Joseph is not going to meet the men he meets if he stays in Potiphar's house, because they end up in the prison. And so Joseph had to be in the prison to meet them. And Yahweh was with him through this. In chapter 40, the two men that I mentioned, the chief baker and the chief wine steward, were both in prison. Now, my speculation, and it's just something to give some feeling of context or fabric, sense of texture to the story, is that maybe there was a poisoning incident, and Pharaoh's food and wine taster died, and we don't know whether it was the wine bearer or the baker. Put them both in prison till we can sort this thing out. That's at least a plausibility, and I'll tack that one on there. And so they're in prison, but they happen to be in the prison that Joseph's now in charge of, as a resident assistant or whatever. And they had a dream. Each of them had a dream, and the dreams were very, very similar. And so, but they were disturbed by the dream. And verse 8, it says, of chapter 40, verse 8, we have had a dream, and there's no one to interpret. I mean, that's why that's a vivid dream that I remember well, and nobody tell me what it means. So Joseph said, don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me. Wow, that's kind of interesting that he saw his relationship with God so clearly that he saw himself as one that could take what God had given to a man and explain it to him. And so the cupbearer told his dream, and Joseph said, well, you know what that means is in 3 days you will have the wine cup in your hand again, serving it to Pharaoh. Whoopee ding. He says, please, please, please remember me when you get out, because I am here unjustly. All right, I'll do that. And when the baker saw that Joseph's interpretation was favorable to the wine bearer, he told his. And he said, well, your dream also has a 3-day span. In 3 days from now, Pharaoh is going to take your head off and hang you up on a tree, and the birds of the heavens are going to eat your flesh. And both dreams came true. But the wine bearer either conveniently forgot Joseph, or just for some reason didn't mention him. Maybe he slipped it into his back pocket for a better time, or maybe he's just a Hebrew kid in here, and I'm concerned about, I just got my job back, and I don't want to bother Pharaoh with it's just it's strenuous. It's kind of like when you sprain your ankle and you take your first tender step. You don't want to put too much weight on it. So maybe that's what's going on. For some reason, I don't care what it is, the cupbearer didn't remember Joseph, and that went on for a couple years, languishing in prison. In chapter 41, there's another dream. It says, 2 full years. And then Pharaoh had a dream. He said, well, it's 2 dreams. Well, no. Joseph said the dream is 1. He dreamed about the cows and the corn. Not the cows in the corn, the cows and the corn. 7 fat cows ate up the 7 skinny cows. And 7 skinny cows ate up the 7 fat cows, and were just as gaunt and skinny as a cannibalistic cow. That must have been an interesting dream. And then woke him up and dreamed another dream of 7 fat, luscious ears, and then gobbled up by 7 lean ears, and he couldn't figure it out. And his magicians, verse 8, 41:8, now it came about in the morning that his spirit was troubled, so he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men, and Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. And then Woohoo! What an opportunity for him. The chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I'm going to make mention of my offenses. I'm going to remind you of the time that I did something wrong. And I was in prison because of it. And there I met a man who took my dream and restored me as you see today. And everything he said came out just exactly. And so, verse 13, he restored me to my office, but he hanged the baker, and just exactly what you did. So Pharaoh quickly and eagerly brought Joseph in to tell him the dream. And he told him the dream, and he told him more than the dream. He says, here's what you're going to have to do to save this nation alive. And Pharaoh, as you know, said, we don't have anybody in our whole administration as wise and understanding as this young man. Put him in charge of the program that he says is coming. And so he was, verse 46, he was 30 years old when he was made second in command of all Egypt. Verse 41, so Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. And bow the knee and bow the knee to Joseph, verse 43, and he set him over all the land, except, of course, him. And so Joseph has everybody in Egypt, the Egyptians and all of their underlings, the vassal nations, the dependent nations, anybody who would come, bow the knee to Joseph, which of course is exactly what God said would happen, how he promoted Joseph in the dream. Well, this goes on, and I don't want to go into the story of all that, but now there's the famine so if it's in the famine, if it's in the second year of the famine, then Joseph's been on the throne for several years already. And his father sends his brothers to get grain. And of course they come and they see this Egyptian overseeing the grain, and they bow to him. They have no idea that it's Joseph. But Joseph recognized, verse 8, 42:8, he recognized his brothers, but they didn't recognize him. You know, first of all, he was sold as a slave. Secondly, he's probably dressed as an Egyptian. And so, and thirdly, there's been a significant number of years that have passed. It'll turn out to be like 17 years before Daddy sees him. So it's been 15 years at this point of time since they last saw their brother. And he didn't look like this, and they don't expect him to be here. Say, what will become of that dream? So he recognized them, but they didn't recognize him, and then he remembered the dream. So we have Joseph promoted, his brothers coming for grain, and you know the story of the back and forth. I want to get to what I consider one of the most significant pieces of the story. I put forth Joseph as a prefigure of Jesus. And what we have in his manipulating of who got the grain and who got the money back and who got the silver cup back, and all of those things, and the holding of Simeon and the demanding of Benjamin to come, and then Benjamin is caught out. All of those things were orchestrated by Joseph, not as a taunt, not as a mean-spiritedness, not as a get even. I am firmly convinced that Joseph orchestrated this entire 2-year thing with his brothers to crack their heart and bring them to repentance. I'm as persuaded of that as I possibly can be. Joseph is playing the part of a brother who wants his brothers to have that relationship with God that he does. But they can't as long as they're stuck in their jealousy, in their hatred, in their arrogance. You realize they didn't care what they were doing to their father when they sold their brother into slavery. They didn't care about that. They only cared about themselves. Would they ever care about their father? Would they ever care about somebody other than themselves? Would they care about one of their other brothers? Would they care about the brother who was the only other brother of the son of the favored wife? You saw what they did to the older brother of the favored wife, willing to send him off into captivity and break their father's heart. Would they care about their father enough to change their mind of the way they treated the other son of the most favored wife? Well, the story, came where Benjamin is now going to be held, and the other 10 get to go home free because Benjamin was the one with the silver cup. How did he get the silver cup? Well, Daddy gave it to him, right? I mean, not Daddy. Joseph gave it to him, put it there on purpose, just so he could grab him and see what they would do. Then Judah approached him, verse 18, 44:18, and said, O my Lord, may your servant please speak a word in my Lord's ears, and do not be angry with your servant, for you are equal to Pharaoh. My Lord asked his servants, saying, Have you a father or a brother? And we said to my Lord, We have an old father and a little child of old age. Now his brother is dead. So all Judah knew, Joseph was dead. His brother is dead, so he alone is left to his mother, and his father loves him. Kind of looks like Judah cares now, huh? Then you said to your servants, Bring him down to me, that my eyes may see him. But we said to my Lord, The lad can't leave his father, for if he should leave his father would die. And you said to your servants, however, Unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you shall not see my face again. Which translates, the whole family would die because of starvation. Thus it came about when we went up to your servant my father, we told him the words of my Lord, and my father says, Go back and buy us a little food. But we said, We can't. If our youngest brother is with us, we will go down, for we cannot see the man's face unless he's with us. And your servant my father said to us, You know that my wife bore me 2 sons. Excuse me, I get caught up in this story, because this is where Joseph learns for the first time what his father thought happened to him. You know that my wife bore me 2 sons, and the one went out from me, and I said, Surely he is torn in pieces, and I have not seen him since. And if you take this one from me, and harm befalls him, you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow. Now therefore, when I came to your servant my father, and the lad is not with us, since his life is bound up in the lad's life, it will come about when he sees that the lad is not with us, that he'll die. Thus your servants will bring the gray hair of your father, your servant, our father, down to Sheol in sorrow. For your servant, he's talking now about himself, Judah, your servant became surety for the lad to my father, saying, If I do not bring him back to you, then let me bear the blame before my father forever. Now therefore, please, let me remain instead of the lad as a slave to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go to my father if the lad is not with me, lest I see the evil overtake my father? Well, as you know, Joseph couldn't contain himself, but he had accomplished what he wanted to accomplish. Look at the heart of Judah. I care about my father. I care about what happens to this boy. I will substitute myself for this boy so my father can have his son. Joseph brought about repentance in the hearts of his brothers. This is where the story breaks open, where he reveals who he is, where he invites his father's family to come be with him, and father and sons are reunited, And that piece of the story is done. We're going to stop here because of time. Just a tad bit more I want to say about Joseph and Jacob before we look at some things in the book of Exodus. Thank you for being with me today. May God bless you in your walk with Him. Till next week, this is Rod saying goodbye.
Whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know them. For the ways of Yahweh are right, and the righteous will walk in them, but transgressors will stumble in them. For the past hour, you've been listening to Probing the Prophets with Rod MacArthur. Stay tuned each Friday for Probing the Prophets with Rod MacArthur, right here on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.